We acknowledge the Tasmania Aboriginal people as the traditional custodians of this land, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and future who hold the memories, traditions, culture and hope of Tasmania's First Peoples. Library Tasmania also pays respect to the resilience and strength of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people and extends that respect to all First Australian people. I'd like to introduce Lyn, and as you can see, the mystery of William George Dart. So I'll just hand over.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lyn.
And I'm just going to write down the time my computer's at now because it's 21:48. I have to keep a good track of the time. See, I'm not going over. It's taken me a long time to condense information I had to make something into a PowerPoint that's not going to go for hours. So welcome to the mystery of William George Dart. My Lyn. Oh, sorry. I just need to see my computer. Oh, so I can. Is it better here?
No, right. This is your microphone.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, right. Okay. That's better. Sorry. I'll start again. So, welcome to my talk on the mystery of William George Dart, my great-grandfather, and there's a few other descendants of William George Dart in the room as well. Do you want to put up your hand?
Wow, well done.
A few. We knew we had a great-grandfather, William George Dart. We knew nothing about him. Like so many of us, we know nothing about certain ancestors. We just knew he was a mariner, and we managed to piece together a lot of information and make a booklet about him. This one here. Now, I really love researching, but I really don't like writing, so Sue, my cousin here, really nagged at me, and she helped me write it, so it wouldn't have happened without Sue, actually. So, in Sue's family was Arthur Dart, a grandson of William George Dart, and, right, next slide, that's right. So we have no knowledge of family, and Sue's father Arthur wrote a letter in the 16th of April 1973, and somehow we managed to glean that he was on board the ship at the boat Acacia, and we just knew that his father, Arthur Henry Dart, had a lot of ill feeling towards his father, and the feeling was that the family had been left in the lurch, and Arthur asked the question, was he a good person, was he a bad person? And in my family we used to talk about him as well. What happened to him? Dad said his father, Arthur, was very bitter, and he remembers one of William George's brothers coming to Arthur one day and saying, I want to tell you what happened to your father. And Pa just said, he was no father of mine. I don't want to talk about it, I don't want to know. So when I started looking for him in earnest, the facility, the resources were not available on the internet that are now. There wasn't the digitisation of newspapers, less digitisation of any records. So I think that's one of the reasons I found a long time to find him. Whereas once I found where he was, it became easier. So one day I did find him, but where he was really surprised me. I couldn't work out why he was where I found him. And I'm not going to tell you that now. I'm going to wait till the end. So I'm going to tell you the journey of how I pieced together where I found him, going backwards to the little bit of information we knew. So I hope it's interesting, and I hope some of the resources I used may be helpful. So here we have a photo of him. My auntie Jean had that photo, and it fortunately had the photographer on the back, Bishop Osborne Photographers, Hobart, and the dates. So I think that probably coincides. It was a special photo taken when he gained one of his qualifications, or it was a special occasion photo, I think. So I managed then through Libraries Tasmania. Here there's a lot of records upstairs in the archives, especially Marine Board records, because there's so many records taken when a a master and a crew goes on a voyage. There's a cruise agreement. It gives so much information, and I was able to find out a lot through that. So this is his first voyage. Is that, if I enlarge that, just going to affect that? Yes, it is. Hang on a sec. So you'll see this is on the Julia. It's coming back into Hobart in November 1862. It left in September 1861, and it went into the South Seas, and it was to get blackfish oil, which is whale oil. And if you look at the cabin there, in the cabin is Mrs. Dart and 2 children. So this is my great-grandmother. She's gone on a voyage and she's taken 2 children. William George wasn't quite 3, and his second brother, Charles Francis, was not quite 1. So she went for just over 12 months on the Julia, which was a smallish vessel, and I wouldn't have liked to do that, trying to keep track of these little children on board a sailing vessel. Then there's a gap in the records, can't find anything, but again, through the Marine Board records, I was able to find his first voyage as a seaman. If you look here, is this little clicker? Yeah, here he is, William George Dart, and his first voyage. And he's as a boy, so that's he's just right at the bottom of the ranks on the ship. You notice too, there's another person here, this William Hall. It's his second voyage, and he's a boy as well. So he's going to sea first with his father, and that's aboard the Sapphire, and that's a picture of the Sapphire. That's come from the archives here as well. That's at New Wharf in Hobart. So Sue and Donald went to the Maritime Museum to see what information they could find, and you managed to get a copy of his apprenticeship record, his indenture, and that was with Dowdall and Belbin, who were agents at New Wharf in Hobart as well. And that's got some really interesting stuff in it. It tells what the Dowdall and Belbin had to provide to give him an adequate, to teach him how to be a seaman, and what he had to provide as well. It gives his pay rates. So there's a lot of information in that record. So here it was for 4 years. This is what they had to teach him how to be a mariner. They had to give him food, lodging, and then they had to pay over those 4 years £62, and it gives the rate for each year. And he had to provide his own bedding and wearing apparel and other necessities. So during that apprenticeship, he sailed on the Clematis and the Southern Cross. And what I needed to do, some of those records are digitised and some aren't. So I set up at the microfiche and went through each voyage for each of the ships, and I was able to find out where the vessel went and whether he was on board when he changed vessels. And some of that information too came from the increasing digitisation of newspaper records through Trove. They weren't available when we first went looking. And there's a good little site called Mariners and Ships in Australian Waters. It gives all sorts of information about vessels in and out of Australian states and in and out of the country, and it also can give lists of passengers, a list of crew, and a lot of those records come from the State Records Authority in New South Wales, and that's a really handy little site. While he was an apprentice, you can get sort of little stories and anecdotes, and this one came from the Mercury, and I'm going to have to, can I come around here? Yes, I might go the other way. So it's telling about the brig Clematis, and I'm going to enlarge that so I can read it. It arrived from Newcastle into the Dunn Street Pier. It had left Newcastle and had fair weather until southerly gales were experienced on the 3rd of the month. And then there was a serious mishap, and it nearly attended with loss of life. The vessel was about 35 miles off Cape Barren, and a westerly breeze was blowing, and it was labouring heavily in the sea. And a seaman named William Cole and an apprentice named William Dart were aloft, stowing the fore top gallant sail when the foretopmast carried away at the cap and falling, it took the upper portion of the main topgallant mast with it. So, of those who were aloft, Cole fell to the deck, and I'm looking for my place, and I moved out the deck and was taken up insensible. And Dart had a miraculous escape. He managed to hold on to the topgallant rigging, and when he felt the mast going, and he fell down with the wreck, which was hanging by its rigging, and managed to scramble out. He was very shaken, but was okay. But Cole had to be conveyed to hospital in a cab when the vessel arrived. And it was Captain Garth, and he was full of a lot of praise for the officers and crew. And I just think it shows what a dangerous life these people live. I actually found one of his brothers, John or Jack Dart, wasn't a professional sailor, but he was involved in delivering vessels through the eastern states of Australia. And he had a very similar incident going into Sydney Harbour, and it's just very dangerous. So he didn't stay as a boy or for very long. He served as a bosun on the Clematis, and then he gained his certificate as a second mate in Dunedin, and then he qualified here as a first mate. And so those records, Papers Past is a good site, in New Zealand site for finding information. That was recorded in Papers Past, and the Marine Board records here. So the record for gaining qualification of a first mate is this one, and it's number 75, and there are 15 documents in that file. So you can get a lot of information from that file. There's references, records of ships he's served on, and certificates. So, for example, in that file is his first mate certificate. It shows how, years ago, somehow or other, I got hold of his certificate from New Zealand, and I didn't know about recording things then, and I've got it sitting in my files, and I have got no idea where I got it, but it's there. So also online, there's the cruise agreements. Some of these are online, some of them aren't. I think this one isn't, but you'll see here. Where am I? Here he is, William George Dart. He's from Tasmania, and what does that say? Can I look? It tells where he joined the vessel. It says the date. Now I've lost the wrong button, and his position. And I think it's just interesting too. If you look at that document, wrong button again. Look, is it Tasmania, Yarmouth, Canton, Yarmouth, Norway, Shetland, Manchester, and then for some reason it's repeated, and I don't know why. So the crews of these ships came from all over the world. They weren't just Tasmanians. And then the other side of this record here keeps, and for some reason that keeps moving up there, I don't know why, tells you, so here's William George Dart, tells you his pay rate, when he's on the vessel, and when he's signed off. So there's lots of information there, and that's one of the ways I was able to track the ships that he was working on. And this is the front of the agreement, so Acacia, where it's registered, the size of the vessel, who owned it, you've got the captain. These are the rations that had to be provided for the crew. And here it's interesting, it says where the ship's going to be going, but at the end it says that the crew can be discharged anywhere at the captain's discretion. So just because you're leaving from Hobart doesn't mean you might end up in Hobart. And here is a photo of the Acacia, and I found this online, and it belongs in the State Library of Victoria. His father died in 1880, 89 I should say, and he was the mariner. So, but I did find this in the Mercury, when he gained his qualification as a second mate, it was reported here in Hobart. I think it shows how important shipping was then, and it says that he'd been serving in that capacity aboard the Acacia for some time. So that was courtesy of when Trove became more. developed. So I found this online too, and I think this shows maybe our changing attitudes to fishing wildlife. So it's from the North Otago Times, and the mysterious fish who had been 4 or 5 months cruising about in the Bay of Oamaru and defying all attempts to catch it was killed on the 25th. A boat's crew under Captain Herbert and Mr. Dart left the vessel intent upon its capture. And after some chasing, the fish rose under the bows and was dexterously harpooned by Mr. Dart. It was towed alongside the bark and hoisted on board, and formed the object of a considerable amount of interest to a number of visitors as it lay on the main hatch. It was a large species of porpoise, commonly known as a cowfish, and it was 9'6" long and a circumference of about 4 feet. And when it struck by the harpoon, it spouted a great quantity of blood, which dyed the water a deep red. And here's something interesting too. The captain intended to have the skin tanned for boot leather, and it's estimated the blubber will yield about 10 gallons of oil. And that was the paper's past sight. So these two references came from the files for when he was applying to become first mate and a master. This one is a reference from Thomas Herbert from the Acacia, and this one here is from William Belbin. And I've put them in there because in the light of the question, was it good or bad, I think it shows that he was held in high esteem by the people that he worked for. He's always been provide satisfaction and a sober and trustworthy officer. And over here, I think at the bottom it says he testified his character. He found him sober, steady, what's that word? Civil, that's right, and obliging and strictly honest. And so that file has 15 documents, and I said this one here, the master's one's got 13 different documents in it. And these ones are actually available online. You can see those documents. And he gained his master's certificate 6 months after the first mate certificate. And I put this in here to say what a captain does. I think it's a pretty incredible job, actually. He was responsible for the crew, cargo, insurance, negotiation of contracts while aboard, provisioning of the ship. He was required to discipline the crew and act as a doctor where necessary. So he controlled the whole ship with the help of his mates. He was required to make safe, speedy and profitable trips for the owners. And most captains had worked their way through the ranks. You had to push a ship hard to keep it on schedule regardless of the weather, but you also had to look after the ship so that then there wasn't a lot of damage done to it. Now we get to, that's his background, now we get to a mystery, first mystery really. When we started researching, or I did, another relative and my sister had done some research, we were looking at possible family members, and there was also this William George Sidney Dart hanging around, born in 1884, to William Dart, a mariner, and Ellen Dart, formerly Larkins, in Hobart. And we couldn't find no other William Dart mariner here. I couldn't find a marriage for a William Dart and an Ellen Larkins. I looked in Australian records overseas, couldn't find it anywhere. So then I thought I'll start looking at Ellen Larkins, and I found 2 in Tasmania and 2 marriages for both of them, and I looked at them to see if I could find a William George Sidney with the new surname. And I actually, so this Ellen, she married William George Henry James Guppy. And another thing that made me look was I looked at those registration records, which are now available on the Tasmanian Names Index, which is really good. So you have a signature here, Ellen, wrong button again, Ellen Dart, mother, and here she's Ellen Larkins. And I actually thought, though, that way she's written Ellen is actually very similar to me. It looks as though it's probably written by the same person. So then I started looking for William George Sidney Guppy. And William George Sidney is less common combination of names. And I found a William George Sidney Guppy who married Mary Ann Hallam in 1911. When Ellen Guppy, or Larkins, died in 1947, she listed her eldest son as William, but I'd only found Guppy children for the rest of the children. I hadn't found a William Guppy with a birth registration. And when he died in 1953, which I got again from the Mercury, it said he was 68, which gives a birth year of 1884. So I feel quite strongly that this was William George's first son, William George Sidney Guppy. And another thing is too, my grandfather, the first child, was Arthur. And there'd been Williams and Leonards in the family for a long time. I thought it was unusual that that name hadn't continued. So then so that's the first mystery. I think I've sort of solved it. In 1886, he married my great-grandmother, Amelia Terry, and so this shows how records can sometimes give you clues. This Frank Hewitt was his eventual brother-in-law, and Flora Jeffrey happened to be living, her family lived in Ware and Worley Street. Well, they were living on the corner of Ware and Worley Street, so she was a neighbour, because I tried to see if she was a relative, but she wasn't. Then my grandfather, he was born in 1886, and they were living on the corner of Ware and Worley Street. My Auntie Jean actually told me that. She didn't know anything about Ware and Worley Street. She just said to me one day when I was asking questions, she said, oh, when Dad was born, his parents were living on the corner of Ware and Worley Street. So it shows how families can give you information. And there's other information on this record too. If you look here, this W.K. Thomas uncle, he's in Elizabeth Street. He actually lived in Melbourne, I know that. He was the brother of Amelia's mother. And Auntie Jean also told me she thought Amelia's mother was a midwife. I haven't found any evidence for that, but maybe he was even born here in Elizabeth Street. I'm not sure. Now, the next thing that happens, I think, what's going on here? Ancestry put up Tasmanian police records. Okay, 2 months after Arthur's born, Amelia's issuing William George with a warrant, leaving her. And he's without any means of support. And it gives a description here of him as well. And you think, what's happening here? You know, and I must go back to, if we look at, I won't go back, I'll just say, when he married Amelia and when the birth registration for Arthur, he is listed as a storeman. So he's not working as a sailor, he's not using any of his qualifications. So then, what so often happens with this man, he disappears again for 4.5 years about. He left Tasmania and can't at the moment get any evidence of his whereabouts. Hopefully one day I might. Until Ancestry again, and I don't just use Ancestry exclusively, had Victorian police records online, and I found a warrant for his arrest in Victoria because he'd been working for over 12 months as a debt collector, and one day they were looking for him because he'd gone out for work one day, and then at the end of the day they found his horse and cart in a lane near the business, and they don't know if he'd left it there or if it just wandered there. And because he'd been debt collecting for the day, it said he had about £30 with him. And he'd gone back, the police went because he lodged with a Mrs. Coote, and he called in there and told her that he'd met a young friend who was upon hard times, and he was going to get some things to help the friend. And she'd known him from Tasmania years ago and asked him how he'd gone, and he said pretty fair. They found he'd taken everything from his room except a few things that weren't worth anything. I looked up Mrs. Coote actually through Victorian rate records, and I found her husband was called a man called Audley Coote, Audley, and he was a fellow mariner. So I think they probably knew him quite well. And she did say that they said he was a master mariner and that he had been a whaler, which isn't quite. He was the son of a captain of a whaler, and she does say that he's unmarried. So there's the that information appeared in the Mercury in Hobart, saying that he was wanted, and then something interesting happens. The warrant is cancelled in Victoria in the same week, not the same date. I looked at when the gazettes were published, and he turned up in Hobart and surrendered himself to the police. So I'm assuming somehow the money must have been paid back in Victoria as well. So he's turned up, and then he disappeared again. He didn't actually disappear. So that's in September. On the 20th of October 1892, he signed on with the vessel Honolulu. If you look here, he signed on as a second mate. He was last on the Acacia, and then he, is that the one with the date he had to be on board is actually earlier than his sign-on date. It's that's on the other side, I think. No, so anyway, he signed on much earlier than his sign-on date, so he's left Hobart very quickly to go. So the Honolulu was bound for the Philippines, Manila, and then he was discharged on the 5th of September 1893. So I then looked at the Honolulu, no, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So meanwhile, back in Hobart, Amelia gave birth to our great aunt, Ruby. My Auntie Jean told me her birth date. Now, I haven't been able to find a registration for her. And she'd moved to Elizabeth Street, and she was taking in boarders. And that's, she'd also given witness in a death, and that's how I picked up that address, because it told the address. The person who died had been living in her boarding house, so it gave the address. So I hunted online via Trove for that address, and that's how I found that advertisement. Time, okay. Am I going okay for time? Yes. Good. So after the Honolulu, the next I found him, it was actually via the Strathmuir records. I knew he'd been on the Strathmuir, so I worked backwards, and it said on his records of enlistment with the Strathmuir that he'd been last on this ship, the Glendoon. So the Glendoon, he went on board the Glendoon in New York. That was bound for Yokohama. So he gave his address still as Ware Street, Hobart, but he'd been living in Cherry Street, Manhattan, and that's just behind the wharves. And it was really interesting when I was telling Amelia, our daughter, about it. She said, she'd been to New York. She said, I know Cherry Street. When we were visiting my friend, we passed through this big sign that said Cherry Street. If I'd known, I would have gone down to Cherry Street and had a look. So the Glendoon was sailing to Yokohama, then it went to Oregon, and then it went to New Zealand, and then to Hamburg. And I was able to find all this information through newspapers. So some of them are the Newcastle Morning Herald and Miners Advocate gave me a lot of information. There's a digitisation of newspapers here, and the Memorial University of Newfoundland has got a lot of cruise lists. You can get cruise lists at the National Archives in Britain, and but this museum has a lot of cruise lists as well. But not all cruise lists have been digitised or kept. And this is the Glendoon. So you can see the ships are getting larger as he goes along. So he, when he enlisted on the Glendoon, he gave his last ship as Honolulu. And I knew Honolulu through the Newcastle newspaper, had been in and out of Australia quite a lot. So the records for the cruise lists and agreements weren't digitised, so I actually got some people to go to the archives in New South Wales in Sydney to look at the cruise agreements, and found no, definitely he hadn't been back to Australia aboard the Honolulu. So there's a gap again of where was he between the Honolulu and the Glendoon. Then his next ship was the Strathmuir, which he joined in Hamburg, and he was engaged as a first mate. That was in 1899. And the final destination was Sydney, but it went to Canada, New Brunswick, then Rotterdam, and then it went to Londonderry. And he was discharged there in 1889, but signed on again, and then he was the captain of the ship. And that's the first time we know of that he ever used his master's certificate. There's a lot from 1884, so there's a big gap there. So that a lot of that came from newspaper records, and the archive.org shows a photo. There's a book, record of Canadian shipping, and that's where I got some information about the Strathmuir. So I just spent a lot of time keying in words into search engines, and not just reading the first few links that come up, really trawling through them and seeing what little clue I can get to lead to that may lead to a slight bit of information that may lead to something else, and I really enjoy it. So now we're back to where I found him, and why was I where I found him. So the 1901 census became available online in England, and I just decided again I'd put his name into things, see if he came up anywhere, and here he is. I've got the little red thing on, he's about here, William George Dart, he's got his age, where am I, able seaman and Tasmania. So I knew it was him, and I'm thinking, why is he in the Birkenhead Union Workhouse when I knew nothing about him at the time. I think, why has he ended up there? So then I thought, I went back to when Jack Dart could have visited my grandfather. I knew when Jack Dart died. I had this date, so I thought something must have happened in between those two dates. So didn't find anything on Ancestry, but on Find My Past, I found his death in 1902. So I decided to send away for his death certificate, which arrived in the mail, and it made me cry. Because here it is. Strathmuir Workhouse Infirmary, 43, captain of the sailing vessel MS of Birkenhead. I couldn't work out what that was. And it said, how he died. Concussion of the spine and ascending degeneration, concomitant with a fall from a loft on board the sailing ship Strathmuir. And further that the evidence is sufficient to show how this said fall was caused. There's insufficient evidence to show how this fall was caused or what was the date. And it said they held an inquest. So what I did was, actually I rang. I looked at where's the nearest archives to this, and I rang the people, because I think, it was a phone call overseas, didn't last very long. I said, I'm ringing from Tasmania, Australia. And I explained what I needed to know. And the people there were so helpful. And this packet came in the mail, and they didn't just send the information about the inquest, they sent the creed register for the infirmary, the workhouse, and they sent newspaper clippings and information about the Strathmuir, and a lot of these things still, a copy of the inquest is still not available online. So it's really important to contact archives. And here, I think too, here he is, William, he came into Birkenhead on the Iberia to Morpeth Dock. He was a ship's captain. Wife, Minnie of Hobart. So Amelia, Minnie, so I found out that he called my great-grandmother Minnie, and her mother's name, my grandmother's name was Minnie. He had a friend, Charles Guthrie in Liverpool, and I haven't really been able to find anything about him, so maybe he was a sailor, but I might look again now. I haven't looked for a long time, and there was a Mr Wood here of Church Road, so hopefully he wasn't completely alone. But they also sent me, what I decided to do, again, this isn't available online, but I got somebody to go to the National Archives, to the Guildhall Library section, and I found his, because I'd been looking again to that shipping cruise list site that I talked about before. It tells you where the records for Lloyd's captains are. And so this man who I've used a couple of times went along and found his registration in the Lloyd's list. And I think it's really special to have an ancestor who was a Lord Captain on the Lloyd's list. And it said where he was born, when he passed his master's certificate, and the number of it. And it also says, good. It also says this is where he's joined the Strathmuir, and it's got these dates and this NA. It's got the other abbreviations, what they stand for, but the NA here stands for North America, Greenland and Iceland, and that's where those records were found for me. Then, this falling from when he fell from up in the rigging, which is actually foreshadowed in a way by the newspaper article I showed you before, when he was an apprentice. Sue and my cousin Sue and Donald, they found this really good book called The Cape Horn Breed at the Maritime Museum, and I can't find my copy and they can't find theirs. We have no idea where they are. That was really interesting. It was written by this Captain Jones, who was an apprentice between 1905 and 1909 on the same sorts of routes, and it gave us a really good understanding of what life was like on these vessels. It's standing up in water that's rushing up, and you're trying to hold on and not get washed off, and how cold it was. It was an extremely difficult life. And that's a really good read if you've ever come across it. So Strathmuir left Londonderry for Valparaiso in Chile, and then the people in the archives sent me this newspaper cutting, which as far as I know still isn't available online with the British Newspaper Archive. And it's in the Birkenhead News, and it talks about the inquest and his death. So I'm going to do this again. So it tells you about the inquest, and that he was brought from Montevideo to Birkenhead by the steamship Iberia as a distressed seaman. And it says that he'd fallen from a loft 2.5 years ago. So he was in that workhouse infirmary after he arrived back. So they had to sail all the way around Cape Horn to get into the hospital, and then he had to come by the Iberia to Birkenhead. So it's a long voyage, and I don't know what his pain was like and being able to move. So his story, as related to the workhouse master, was that he left Londonderry, and at Valparaiso he shipped some blacklegs. Now Captain Jones explains what blacklegs are. So when crew were discharged from ships, they would go and enjoy themselves in port and not be in a very good state when it was, and shipping agents would come along, take them to the ship, and they'd be signed on as crew. Sometimes they didn't even know that they were on a ship till they woke up properly. And you couldn't guarantee that they were good sailors or not. And blacklegs were sailors who weren't good crew. So he said he didn't know, his crew didn't know their duties and they were useless. So he had to go aloft himself. And he fell, injuring his spine. So he was taken to Montevideo and then back to England. And Dr. Eva McCall she was a doctor in the workhouse at this time, the infirmary, and she said that he couldn't possibly have recovered from his injuries. So, we knew his fate, but there's still lots of mysteries. What was he doing after he gained his master's certificate? He seemed very keen to get the master's certificate. Why did he go? Where did he go? What was he doing between leaving the Honolulu and enlisting on the Glendoon? I hope I find out one day. Why did he leave his wife and family? I can understand why Pa said he was no father of mine, because he was never there. And his mother must have struggled. And Arthur Dart, his grandson, asking the question, was he good or bad? So Sue found this quote on the Online Guardian, which we thought really came along at such an appropriate time. Death is rarely the end of any story. The dead are silent, yet they speak to us. Stories are born out of our attempt to answer the questions they provoke. Where there's a void, our brains rush in to create a truth, as if by doing so we can bring back the missing and resurrect the dead. That's from a lady called Liz Jensen, and we thought that was so apt for this story. Yeah. That's my story. I wondered if maybe he was on one of their ships. So, but you know, with William George Dutch, he was so lucky with all these records. It's given such a good picture where they're available. Mm. Yeah. Anyone got any other questions? Yes.
I suppose the Hobart Marine Board records were really fascinating. Does that, like when they list who's on the ship, is that just the officers or is it all the crew?
No, I'll show you. So this is actually one for Glendoon, but it's the same here. So, and some of them have more pages than this, so it gives you, as I said, the agreement at the start, and then it lists all the crew on the ship, and then this page goes with it here. So it gives you all the crew. It tells you where they're from, the date they were their last ship, the date they were discharged, the day they come onto this ship, and the day they're discharged from this ship. So it gives you a lot of information for tracking.
I'm very interested to look at the library also has the Launceston Marine Board records, because I imagine they'd have a separate record source. Because I have an ancestor that was on the whole of the ships that we don't know when he arrived. So
oh, okay.
It's give me a really useful lead.
Yes, it will. So some of the Marine Board records now are available. They're digitised, so you could go into the Tas Archives site, the library site, and you can actually see them online. But some of them aren't. But I don't know about what. Do you know where Launceston, the Hollingham ships would be?
I think we have a lot of the records here.
Yeah, it'd be handy to just contact here, and like the people did in the Wirral archives, they would be able to point you in the right direction. Yeah. Yeah.
Was there a surgeon on the ship that he had his accident on?
I don't know, because that voyage record is not available. So unfortunately, I don't have the crew agreement that says, you know, captain of the ship, and so I don't know. Maybe he had to do the. Oh, I think looking back to the book written by Captain Jones, there wasn't a surgeon on those ships, was there? Do you remember, Sue?
No, I can't.
I think the captain had to do someone on board had to do anything major that needed doing. Yeah. Yes.
I'm sorry for being a little bit confused here, but
Oh, that's okay.
there's been a lot of really interesting details. But at the start, you said that you couldn't understand why you couldn't find him, implying to me that he was sort of there in plain sight somehow.
It was because when we were looking for him to start with, there hadn't been a lot of digitisation of records. The newspapers weren't available online, so I couldn't just go to a computer and key in his name and the way I can now, and things come up. So I had to wait for records to become available, and once I got that census record, it gave me a bit of traction to get going, and then the fact that there's been so much put online since enabled me to find it. And as I said, I just have to use search engines and go in and key in words and track down sites. Oh, this might give me information, then I'll read it, and then it might lead to another one. So it's taken a bit of work like that. But the fact that they're digitised now has been helpful. And then, as I said, I used a researcher for a few of the records because they're not available online. Yeah. And I wondered how people go too with the names as William. I called him William George because his father's William, and then we've got two Arthurs, and yeah.
No more questions?
Well, I would just like to thank